Uh, my work for my PhD and before has been on invasive species. And with this talk, I'll talk to you about invasive species in general, particularly from the Andaman Islands, where I've done most of my fieldwork in. And I'll talk to you about invasive species in the context of citizen science and using public knowledge or community knowledge to inform invasive species science and management, right? So just a brief definition for people who are hearing about biological invasions or invasive species for the first time. So species that are moved beyond their natural distribution or natural biogeographic range by humans to another location, those populations can go on to become invasive species. So if you are to be an invasive species, you not only need to be introduced, that is, you're introduced to a new area, you need to breed and spread. And more often than not, these sort of invasions results in detrimental impacts on native biodiversity. So invasive species are a major driver for global change because this is pervasive. It happens all across the globe. And they have been implicated to be a major reason behind biodiversity loss. And this is going to increase only in the future. And there's a recent paper a couple of years ago which showed that there is no saturation in the accumulation of alien species worldwide, that there is just an exponential curve, if you may, that invasive species are increasing by the year. And this is mostly because we live in a very globalized world where there is a lot of trade, transport, and with it comes the trouble of invasive species, if not checked properly, if there are no biosecurity measures to check their spread along with traded goods. So in an invasion, this is generally how it looks. If you see the figure, the stage one is pre-introduction, nothing has happened. And then from initial incursion to an exponential rise and then a plateau of dominance. So this is how generally invasion looks. To break it down a bit further, so this is how a population, let's say it's at stage 0 where it is not been transported yet. And then it has to cross each of these barriers of geography, of captivity, and of survival and so on to finally become invasive. Let's say we take a few individuals and transport them. And then once they're at this new site, they're introduced. And once they are able to breed and survive, they're called established, or that's the establishment stage. And once they're spreading on their own from that area and generally causing impact, they would be called invasive. In many of these cases, as you can see in this figure, that it results in invasion failure. As you will see on the bottom, there's a massive bar called invasion failure. And at each of this stage, some of these introductions or some invasions may not be successful. And that is generally the case. The rule of thumb is, it's called the tens rule. That means of every 10 introduction events, only one is successful to be properly invasive. That is, they can breed and spread in a new area all on their own, right? So that is some invasion 101. And let's just jump straight into some real world examples of, and this is all based on what I've worked on. So the Indian bullfrog, it is native to the Indian subcontinent, and we even have it in Odisha. But on Andaman Islands, it's non-native. It was never found there naturally. And only very recently, after 2000, that it was first reported there. So even though politically it's still in India, but biogeographically, it is completely different. So Indian bullfrog was first reported from the Andamans in 2009, although the first scientific report which talks about this date, that was published in 2013. So in essence, for most, for the scientific community, that was when we knew that, oh, the bullfrog is here. And at that time, I was a master's student, and I saw this paper by one of my colleagues, and I was like, oh, that's very cool. But I didn't know the extent to which the bullfrog's invasion has played out. So this is introduced from mainland India, and as you can see, the bullfrog is massive. It's the large adults can go up to 160 millimeters or 16 centimeters, and they weigh up to half a kilogram. And so, yeah, you can see here, we use a reinforced butterfly net in my hand to catch it. So they're very, very, very good at escaping. They'll be generally around water bodies, and if not, they'll be 3 jumps away from a water body, and they know exactly which direction it is. So if you try to chase them, they have really, really strong thighs, and they just jump in 2-3 jumps there into a water body. So we use these reinforced butterfly nets to catch them. So the first aspect of the bullfrog's invasion that I'm going to talk about is how do we, what has happened? When did it get to the Andaman Islands? How has it spread within the Andaman Islands? Because if you understand the island system, it's all the islands are separated by the ocean, and the bullfrog cannot just swim across, right? So yet we see its invasion going on in most islands. So to understand how has this invasion taken place, me and my colleagues thought, why not ask people who would have seen it firsthand? That is key informants, let's say plantation workers, pond owners, and farmers. Because the bullfrog is a synanthropic species and lives near plantation, agriculture, human modified areas. We thought this was a good idea, and we'll see if it was indeed a good idea or not. So the Andaman Islands, for those who have not been, you should definitely visit. It's really beautiful set of tropical islands in the Bay of Bengal, and looks like this. Some of them are really small, and some are, the majority of the area is in 8 major human inhabited islands, where very fortunately, most of it is still under forest cover. The forest cover of Andamans is around 80%, which is not something we are used to hearing in the mainland, right? So the villages or the human habitation are indeed in a matrix of forest, rather than it being the other way around. So in Andamans, we identified up to 91, although there are a bit more than that, 91 inhabited units, or human modified areas, let's call them just villages, because it's still mostly a rural area. Sorry, somebody's mic is on.
Wait, let me see. Yes, you may continue. Just turn on your mic again.
Yes, thanks. Okay, right. So, yeah, so there are these 91 villages in a matrix of forest. The bullfrogs, generally, from what we understand, they're not a dense forest species. And we thought that if this invasion is actually undergoing, then the first report should be from villages where these bullfrogs are likely to occur first before spreading into edge forest and so on. So what we did was, yeah. So the villages typically look like this. The plantations of mostly arecanut plantation. There's this artificial water bodies, and this is a great place for a bullfrog, right? So how do we, even though the idea might be good that you can use key informants in these villages to reconstruct the bullfrog's invasion or to understand how the invasion has taken place, but we must ensure reliability, because there is bound to be uncertainty in the data, there's bound to be biases in the data, and sometimes the data from the public can be plain wrong. So how do we use this data reliably? So we used a method where we combined public surveys and field surveys in all these 91 sites, and we interviewed nearly 10 individuals, key informants, not just anyone in the village, but farmers, plantation workers, and aquaculturists, those who are most likely to encounter the bullfrog. And so that is around 91 villages, so 892 key informant interviews that we carried out. And simultaneously, we would conduct visual encounter surveys in each of these villages. In the questionnaire, we would ask about the year of first observation at that site, the source site, that is where did the bullfrog come from to that site from, and the potential dispersal pathway, what mode of introduction was it. And we used all this data in a false positive occupancy model. I won't go into the nitty-gritties of it. You feel free to ask me later, mail me later. But yeah, it's basically you take your reliable field encounter data, that is, you have seen it yourself, and then you use the public survey data. And then it gives you stats about how reliable is this data, and it incorporates that uncertainty into the data to give you estimates about where the bullfrogs are. We used modal values for each of these other factors, such as year of first observations and source site and dispersal pathways and so on. And we use this source site information as a covariate in analysis. So let's see how the invasion has unfolded. So we got to know that the invasion actually started much earlier than we knew. So it was in 2001 that bullfrogs were first reported from Andamans, and they were reported from two sites, from one site in North Andaman and one in Middle Andaman, the red dots that you can see. And these sites would become the sites that would donate more bullfrogs to throughout Andamans in the future, right? So the arrows from the left corners just mean they came from the Indian mainland, right? In 2004 to 6, there was barely any new site. There was one new site close to the original site of introduction on Middle Andaman, shown here in blue, and which is very typical to be expected in an invasion because it's generally called a lag phase. So the bullfrog is already there, but it takes time for the population to build up and spread, right? Then in 2007 to 9, during that period, more sites popped up. There are a lot of information in these figures, which I don't want to go into full details of. You can read the paper, but suffice to say that there were more sites popping up near the site of the initial two sites. But then boom, after 2009, you could see the green dots popping up on the two smaller islands, the introductions happening within the islands, shown here by arrows, emerging from the original sites and spreading north to south. And the bullfrog spread now is in 2013 to 15 and 16. It's even way more colorful dots pop up, showing that most of the islands and sites are now have bullfrog presence. You would see that there is a bigger island below, which still has the black dots, not colorful dots, showing that there's no bullfrog recorded till then. Well, that site was colonized in 2018 when we did our final survey. But so yeah, even though there is the gap of 60 kilometers by sea within the two islands, human mediated dispersal basically helps the bullfrog spread across. And to break it down a bit further, you could see that it is a near exponential increase in the number of sites occupied on the y-axis and the years in the x-axis. So this is quite classic of biological invasions, as you can see. And by the time I actually started studying the bullfrog in Andaman Islands for my PhD, it had entered its stage of dominance almost. And here was in 2013 was the first report known to science. So which means that all these years, this really crucial years when management could have yielded really fruitful results, that couldn't happen because we didn't know. And we didn't know because we don't really do a lot of public surveys to integrate this data into the scientific knowledge system. Right. But let's break it down even further. How have these spread have happened? So there are two major pathways. One is the fish culture pathway in Andamans, because there is a scarcity of fresh water. People have almost every household has a small water body or a pond in front of their houses, and they use fish fingerlings to have a small scale aquaculture going on. So in those aquacultural stocks, in those freshwater fish fingerling stocks, bullfrog tadpoles they were basically contaminated. And so that led to quite a few cases where fish fingerlings were moved, but bullfrog tadpoles came with, and this was mostly unintentional. But in many cases, there are a lot of sites which got intentionally released bullfrogs, and the reasons were quite interesting, as you would see. So the contaminant pathway of the fish fingerlings were carried out by private traders, departments of fisheries themselves, local self-government organization, and in case of intentional release, we recorded up to 17 recorded case of independent releases to 14 sites. And on an average, people moved these adult bullfrogs around 47 kilometers, but if you see the range, it is anywhere between 6.2 kilometers to 188 kilometers. And this 188 kilometers introduction resulted in a new island being colonized, right? And the reason behind this is bullfrog, even though they're protected under Schedule 4, they are consumed by some part of the community, and it is also a matter of novelty. The frogs on Andaman Islands are really small, they're native frogs, and to see something so massive is a case of novelty. Right. So what we found was the introduction hub for this bullfrog invasion to the Andaman Islands was West Bengal, although some introduction did happen from Chennai, or possibly happened from Chennai, we're not fully sure. But West Bengal acted as an introduction hub, and 3 sites on Andaman Islands acted as dispersal hubs. That is, once the bullfrogs were introduced onto the Andaman Islands, within the islands, these 3 sites played a major role as a donor to other sites. You don't need to focus too much on the numbers here, but suffice it to say that we found the top model, one marked with a star, that is, the bullfrog's occupancy was best predicted by its distance to any of these dispersal hubs. That is, if there is a site which is closer to this dispersal hub, that is more likely to be colonized by bullfrogs. So you can see that the 3 dispersal hubs are labeled here: Nimbudera, Webby, and Diglipur, and the sites closer to them have the highest estimates of bullfrog occupancy. So around 62% of the sampled villages had bullfrogs, and that closely matches the occupancy estimates as well. There are lots of inter-island movements that resulted in 7 of the 8 islands being colonized. And there was, the good thing was that there was very low false positive detection rates. That means only, that was 0.04. That means only 4% of the respondents, they couldn't identify the bullfrog properly, or that was in essence, the error rate in using public surveys with in this analysis. So which is a good thing. And the reason for that is the bullfrog is an easily recognizable species. During breeding season, it has really vivid yellow coloration, and it's a large species, so you cannot mistake it. And it's found nearby all villages, and people see it quite often. They interact with it by eating it or just using it for novelty. So yeah, there's very few chance that one could go wrong. Then we asked one thing about invasive species management, that it cannot really happen without public participation. And to have public participation or public consent, you need to understand what is the perception among the public for these invasive species. So for bullfrog, there was a lot of negative perception in the case. Most people associated it with loss, though some considered it either both beneficial and derogatory or detrimental, and some were neutral about it. And this negative perception mostly arose from the fact that bullfrogs eat small chicks and ducklings, which are a part of a household economy. They're a local scale economy, and they also eat fish fingerlings. This is a stomach flush sample of a bullfrog, which has eaten a tiny fish. Right. So can this approach, using public surveys to inform invasion science, can this be used for other invasive species? Well, there are some potential pitfalls that in some cases that can be a lack of key informants. That is, it is a completely forested, forest dwelling species. Even forest guards may not know about it. And so that is a limitation. There can be misidentification in case of there being a very similar native species occurring, and there are other things to do with sociology that could affect, like recollection bias, shared narratives, and so on. But if appropriate mathematical measures and study designs are used, it can be reliably used to rapidly generate reliable data on invasive species, right? So while we're doing this survey for bullfrogs, because we're undertaking such a massive exercise, traveling to all these 91 sites and interviewing 10 people each at each site. So that shows you, like, that is the kind of data you need to reliably estimate something, especially with invasive species from public knowledge, because public knowledge can be variable. No matter how many checks and balances you have, you'd rather have a larger sample size than a smaller one. Right. So we also use this opportunity to look at the distribution of two other invasive species, if I may, on Andaman Islands. And I strictly use the biogeographical definition of invasive species here, where I'm not talking anything about, I'm not saying they have put massive negative impacts, but just the fact that they were introduced to this new site where they were never found before, and they're breeding and spreading successfully, including the house sparrow, which is in decline, or allegedly in decline on the Indian mainland, right? So, so the common myna and the house sparrow both are found on the Indian subcontinent, and they were transported to the Andaman Islands quite a few years ago. I think common myna was already in the late 19th century, and house sparrow a bit later. And we were able to estimate the distribution using this framework, using public knowledge. And we found out that common myna spread is associated with major roads, that they're actually using the disturbance created by the major roads to spread. And house sparrows were using jetties or ports to spread, and which is also expected because there have been records of them found on ferries going between the islands. And generally these jetties also have small towns associated with them, which have granaries, and it's not unsurprising to find the house sparrows co-occurring along with that. Right. But this is the use of public surveys to inform invasion science. And now let's get back to the other aspects of the bullfrog invasions. So I'm going to talk to you about how what we found with regards to the impact. So the impact of the adult stage could be that they either compete with the native frogs in terms of food, or they straight up just eat them, because bullfrogs can be highly they're really large species, and anurophagy, which is eating frogs, has been recorded in them in the past. So with this objective in mind, to see if there is potential competition or impact by predation on native frogs, we undertook this study, which is aptly titled "What's for Dinner?" because this was a diet study. And we looked at two native species in comparison to the large bullfrog. You can see the size difference. So one of the native species is Limnonectis in the middle, and the other one is Fejovaria. There is still a lot of taxonomic uncertainty in regards to their specific identity. So we just considered it at the genus level, right? So we looked at 3 sites on Andaman Islands where we did this long-term stomach flushing diet studies. So just to give you an idea about the size differences between the species, I showed you this photo before where there's a massive bullfrog in the foreground, but in the background, there is a Fejovaria species, and it's tiny as compared to the bullfrog. So before we did the study, nothing was really known about what do they eat on Andaman Islands, and we did this systematic study, stomach flushing upwards of, I think, 600 odd frogs to get this data set. And what we found that in the bullfrog's diet, although invertebrates were numerically more, their numbers were higher, but volumetrically, if you look at just the sheer volume of the prey, then vertebrates were way overrepresented. Their diet significantly overlapped with the larger of the native frogs, which is the Limnonectis species in our sample, and so they overlapped up to 83%, indicating that if there is a situation where food is limited, bullfrogs can outcompete or strongly compete with this larger native frogs. They fed on a lot of endemic vertebrates and invertebrates. So there is a emerald gecko, there is a giant centipede, and a species of skink, which are found only in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And we found there was a significant relationship between prey size and predator size. So I'd like you to pay a little bit of attention to this figure. So on the y-axis, it's electivity, which means that if it is 1, then a species strongly prefers it. If it is -1, a species strongly detests it. And if it's at 0, it is in proportion to the availability of that prey. So we looked at prey volumes, which are under 10 millimeter cube, which are under 100 millimeter cube, and so on. And if you will see the Hoplobatrachus species, which is the Indian bullfrog, shown here in red, it doesn't like to eat really small species, and its preference increases with the increase in prey size. The smallest of the species, shown here in green, Fejovaria, it prefers a lot of the smaller species, but it declines as the size increases. And the medium-sized species here, it has a nice bell-shaped curve that it prefers medium-sized prey. It cannot really eat really large prey and really small prey. So this is some bit of cool ecological patterns that you get to see sometimes. But yeah, so that is the potential impact of the bullfrog adults on the Andaman Islands. But amphibians have a tadpole stage. Most amphibians have a tadpole stage, and in case of bullfrogs, they're carnivorous. And so this is nothing new. This has been known for a long time, but we tested it in the context of this invasion, that this is the first time that these amphibians and their tadpoles are encountering the bullfrog. And do they have enough evolutionary strategies against these carnivorous tadpoles? So what we did was look at bullfrogs along with tadpoles of these other two endemic species. One is called the Chakrapani's narrowmouth frog, and the other is called the Andaman tree frog. Right. So they all breed at the same time at the onset of the southwest monsoon, beginning in May, and it comes a bit early to Andamans and subsequently hits the Indian mainland, starting with Kerala. Right. So when it rains, when the first heavy rains come, you could see the bullfrogs turn into this really bright yellow color with blue vocal sacs, and these other two species also breed at the same time. Right. And you could see bullfrogs in amplexus like this. And the morning after this mating frenzy, you would see their footprints on the sand. And right after this explosive breeding event, where hundreds of mating pairs are around you, you would see these clutches of eggs floating in ephemeral water bodies. These water bodies are essentially inundated plantations and shallow ponds and ditches, which when summer goes on and there is a lot of sun and no rain, those water bodies will dry out. And this is in fact considered a strategy for many amphibians, that if you breed in temporary water bodies or ephemeral water bodies, you're less likely to have fish as predators of your eggs, right? So we collected the egg clutches and put them into these tanks. They're really colorful children paddling pools that we use, which are quite nice. And we worked in the peak of monsoon, looking at many combinations of these three species, or all possible combinations of these three species occurrence, and repeating them several times, as you have to do for your experiments. Right. We covered them with predator-proof sheets, and we would measure them every week so that we knew if there was an effect on their growth. So we hypothesized that, as in the case of adults, there should be similar mechanisms of both competition and predation happening. That yes, carnivorous bullfrog tadpoles can eat the native tadpoles. Alternately, they can just compete with them for the limited food that is available to each of these tanks, and that could in potentially hamper their growth and time to metamorphosis and so on, right? And this is also something which is recorded here, is a bullfrog cannibalizing on its conspecific, that it's another bullfrog tadpole that it's eating. So, and what we found was absolutely stunning, that in all these tanks, let me just give you for reference, if Kalula, which is the Andaman tree frog, which is denoted here in just kg, which is the third bar from the left, if it is alone, it has around 60% survival. If MC, which is the second bar, it's on its own without any other species, it has almost 90% survival. They all survive onto metamorphosis and become a tiny frog, right? Bullfrogs have a lot of density dependence. They don't tolerate each other. They can cannibalize. They have around 10% survival on their own. But bullfrog with microhyla, it completely decimates it. Bullfrog with Kalula completely decimates it. It has zero survival in the presence of the bullfrog. Similarly, the last bar, where bullfrog is with both the other species, completely finishes them off. And you can see their survival also increases, but this could be an artifact of the fact that they're all the number of bullfrogs there are less, so the proportion of survival is higher. It's called density dependence. But yeah, and as you can see, none of the native tadpoles or endemic tadpoles survived in the presence of the bullfrog, which was absolutely stunning. We were expecting some competitive effects. That's why we measured all these parameters like growth rate, time to metamorphosis, and so on. But we only found, we could only get microhyla and colula tadpoles to survive till the end only when bullfrogs were not present. Just to give you some basic ecological information, bullfrogs grow the fastest. They grow around 0.5 millimeters every week, microhyla being the second fastest, followed by colula. Time to metamorphosis is shortest in terms of for microhyla, 21 days. But in the presence of bullfrogs, they couldn't survive the 21 days to make it to metamorphosis. So, and metamorphosized bullfrog obviously comes out the largest, followed by colula and microhyla. As you can see in this photo, bullfrog is clearly the largest, followed by microhyla, followed by colula on the right, and microhyla, super tiny frogs, right? But this is a mesocosm experiment, right? In nature, there are way more other complications. There can be predator satiation, which means that yes, bullfrogs will feed on a lot of native tadpoles, but there is a limit to that. They're not hungry after a point of time. They cannot eat more. So some of those tadpoles could survive. There is alternate prey for the bullfrogs in the wild. So they could be feeding on other insects or other species. And that would mean that the effect on the tadpoles, such a severe effect on the tadpoles, is somewhat reduced. There are predators in the wild which can prey on both the bullfrog tadpoles or their eggs and native tadpoles. That can complicate things a bit. And there is more structural heterogeneity, which means the substrates or the hiding places available for these tadpoles are more in a naturalistic setting. So yes, all of these could complicate this really nightmarish scenario that we see, that bullfrog completely decimates or wipes off all these native tadpoles. Right. That brings us to what is the future of the bullfrog's invasion on the Andaman Islands and what is the way forward. So bullfrog is not only invasive on the Andaman Island, but is also present on Madagascar. And it's spreading there slower than Andaman Islands, but still spreading. And it could become a problem for other small islands, especially, or places where there are a lot of water bodies, there's human mediated transfer, and so on, where there are no strict laws to reduce this, and especially in tropical zones, right? But bullfrog's invasion is only one of many invasions that have happened in the Andaman Islands in the past or will happen in the future. In the absence of biosecurity measures, that is, measures that can stop these bullfrog or any other introduced population at the border itself, if those are absent, there will be invasions one after the other, and which has been happening in Andaman Islands, isolated places like Andaman Islands all this while. And this, in the context of the corona pandemic, you would appreciate it better, because this is exactly what we tried to do. We tried to stop flights first from other countries which had COVID, which would have cut off the introduction stage itself. But failing which, we tried to put in measures at the early stages of lockdown, that is to limit the dispersal even more. But that failed. And now we are 1.5 years down the line, experiencing an invasion, which is COVID is an invasion theoretically. So yeah, and what these sort of invasions require is an early detection and rapid response approach, which is you detect it early. If there are 5, say, new bullfrog individuals in a place, you go contain them, euthanize them, or take them to a laboratory setting, right? And because invasion by definition is linked to human activity, so we cannot understand a lot of invasion science and in all its complexity without the use of public knowledge. And there are methods, as I showed you, which can reliably integrate this public knowledge into invasion science and inform their management. Because there was so much about their dispersal pathways, their introduction history that we didn't know. Right. And the good thing is that citizen science has been increasing on the Andaman Islands. It started with a lot of reports of birds, but it can be used to inform invasive species occurrence in the future. We won't have to go door to door to survey, which is the essence of citizen science, that you can get remote participation from interested people all over the area. In that context, there is a portal of India Biodiversity Portal, which has a subsection on spotting alien invasive species. So you can report if you have any invasive species near you, you can report it onto that portal. And with many such reports, scientists can get a much better understanding in real time of what is going on. And that is the power of citizen science. And from this whole experience, I was able to appreciate that this power of that citizen science of public surveys hold. And in my recent research on sleep ecology, I try to integrate some citizen science data that people contribute to platforms like iNaturalist into my research. So yeah, with that, I'd like to thank all these funding agencies, Stellenbosch University, INLAC's Foundation, Rafford Foundation, Center for Invasion Biology that funded all these studies over the years, the Andaman Nicobar environmental team that supported my fieldwork during, I don't know how many years, 6 years that I was there, and the Andaman Nicobar Forest Department for permits and helping us with the research. The MESI lab, where I did my PhD, helped shape a lot of this idea, but none of this would have been possible without my field research assistant, who were Isaac, Bipin, and Suresh, and my co-authors who helped make sense of all these data and collaborated with me through the years. And photos, I thank all these people. And yeah, thank you. I'm happy to take questions. I think we have sufficient time. Thanks.
Hi, Nitin. Nitya, so sorry. Okay, so along the course, we have some pretty interesting questions. I would say some philosophical ones, but yeah, they are nice. And meanwhile, you all can just start putting up questions, and I'll take them from the beginning. Okay, I think Garvit asked if there is a mutation in a native species that causes its spread and disrupts the ecosystem, is it also called an invasive species?
Okay, no. And it generally, in terms of mutation, it doesn't result in a new species, right? It would be, yeah, so no, technically only with human intervention, either intentional or unintentional, when it is moved beyond its biogeographic range, natural biogeographic range, would it be technically called a invasive species. But native species which become dominant in their native range with the help of, let's say, human disturbance, they could be considered invasive, but there is a big debate about it. A school of scientists don't want to call them invasive species because they think that this biogeographical process itself makes this species much different. But yeah, it's up to debate, right?
Okay, so now Devesh asks, he says that I may be wrong as he's not in the field of biology, but are not the areca palms also, they don't belong to the main plants of the Andaman? Because he knows that in Philippines, the agriculture of such palms are causing devastation to the native flora and fauna, especially to the rare Philippine eagles. So can these palm cultivations also be called invasive?
Right. Yeah, good question. So if you saw the stages of invasion that I showed you in the initial figures, one of the stage was cultivation. So it is not, it hasn't become a full-blown invasive species, but it is along this continuum. So it can, but it is still at the cultivation stage. That is without the without intervention from humans, it cannot spread beyond, like, on its own. So for it to be completely invasive, it needs to breed on its own and establish population say at a significant distance apart by spreading. So yeah, all this population in cultivation stage, they haven't yet broken that barrier, but they can. A lot of invasions actually happen when species escape from farms. So for both animals and plants. So for plants, it has happened in the case of botanical gardens. So plants start, like, they're cultivated at this botanical gardens, but they're able to escape from them and spread. Similarly, animals can escape from labs and zoos, like if it is not properly kept. But yeah, it is along the continuum, but it is not fully an invasive species.
Okay. So next, Garvit also asked, can we call Homo sapiens as an invasive species?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is yes, absolutely. So this, I don't know if you know, there is a list called the 100 worst invasive species of the world, which a panel chooses. And when the 100 species was being decided, they said all of the committee wanted to say humans, but obviously that would give out the wrong message. Then people might just feel desolate that there is no point in doing anything about this. But yeah, all invasion biologists agree that from just a biological and theoretical perspective, yes, absolutely, humans are invasive. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sure. So the next is by Srinidhi. She asked, how is stomach flushing carried out? Is it a common method used to identify the diet in animals?
Yes, it is a common method and standardized methods used to understand diet without killing the animals. Because earlier, when this technology was not there, this technique was not developed, people would just dissect the animals to find the diet. And that is very counterproductive because you're in essence killing that animal, and your understanding would be quite limited. So stomach flushing is quite commonly used across species, not just in amphibians, but across species. And the essence of it is you're pumping water into the stomach, and the animal is just regurgitating it. And you collect that, see that, look under a strong lens or a microscope, and you understand what species there are, or you can carry out some molecular analysis on that. And generally what we use is introduce a silicone tube, very similar to the ones used as catheters in humans. So they're very soft, and so they can be slowly introduced into the alimentary canal. And you pump it with water depending on the size of the species. So we have really tiny species for which we'll use a 5 ml syringe or a 20 or a 10 ml syringe. But for the bullfrog, which is massive, and to create that kind of pressure for its alimentary canal to really regurgitate the food, we use around 30 to 60 ml of syringe. And I can say it's a safe method, and you can even do it multiple times. We have stomach flushed the same individuals multiple times over seasons, and we find that they're totally fine. They eat, and you can understand the diet over time. Yeah.
Okay. So she also asked, can you talk about the invasive plants like Lantana and Parthenium?
Yeah, as in it is there are two of the most well-known invasive species, not just in India but around the world, and they have been in India for quite a long time now. And there's the majority of invasion research in India is actually on these two species. So yes, they have numerous impact on the native biodiversity, and yeah, it's absolutely on the top of everybody's mind, especially people looking at invasions, as to how can we even manage them now, because they've become so dominant across our landscapes. But yeah.
Okay, so Isha asked, do invasive species behave in the same derogatory way where they are the native ones? If no, then how do they become invasive to a particular region?
Right, right. Yeah. So what we have to understand is it's not a species which is invasive, but the population becomes invasive, right? And so you're taking a subset of that population from native region and you're introducing it to a like new region. And there are many processes which happen. Let me just break it down in terms of propagal pressure, which is how many individuals were introduced. If you introduce two individuals, it's very likely you're not going to get a successful introduction or the invasion. So if there are like hundreds of individuals introduced, that'll make them successful, right? And if the abiotic factors there are different, like the climate better suits them. In terms of biotic factors, if there are less predators for them at this at this new region, it's a concept known as enemy release. So, which is what happens when a species or population is introduced to a new area, but none of the predators there eat it, because it's completely either it's totally novel or there are no co-evolved predators at that site. And especially this happens in island systems, which are already they have unique species, but they're very species poor as compared to the mainland. So in many of these cases, there are no naturally occurring predators, co-evolved predators at that site, and these populations basically have a free run. They also sometimes lose their parasites, or that things that cause disease on them. So they grow more, they can compete better, and it depends on the native species pool that is there, and how evolutionarily similar or different this species is from them. In essence, in most cases, there are a lot of opportunities that are created for this invasive population, which is why we see that they become different from what their native population or the original population is, in terms of behavior, in terms of physiology, in terms of a lot of other factors, in terms of even body size. So yeah, invasion is a very interesting phenomenon, in the sense that these are all natural experiments occurring. So if you ever wanted the answer to what would happen if this species didn't have a predator, you would get the answer if you study invasions. That is the academic side of it. Yeah.
Okay, so to this, okay, another wrecking havoc thing. What if, so I see a lantana here, and say its native place, it had a parasite which it didn't has, it didn't get it here. So maybe if, someone just for an experiment picks up the parasite from there and introduces it here, let's say in this geographical area too. Can the speciation just bifurcate and this parasite won't even bother about its original host? And that gives us two more invasive ones.
And I didn't understand how this. So you were saying you introduced the native, like the pest of this species or the predator of the species to this area. And and then how does the species bifurcate? I didn't get it.
So the interaction between the host and the parasite, it just does not occur. And, the initial aim of sort of tackling this invasive population with its original parasite somehow fails.
And this parasite itself becomes introduced species. I see. Okay, so it doesn't bifurcate. You're adding another species, right? Yeah, and this is believe it or not, many people have tried this, and this is a really rich part of invasion science. It's called biocontrol, and the idea is very simple: that if the species is doing well because its predators or parasites are not, that why not just get them back, right? And it will control the invasive species, and it can be successful in some cases when it is the parasite is highly target specific, that it only infects that particular invasive species, and once it has reduced, it will die off. But biological processes can be sometimes way more complex, and these biocontrol agents themselves can just not eat after a while or eat very less, and they themselves become big pests. So a lot of famous cases are the cane toads in Australia, which were introduced to control for sugarcane pests, and they themselves became one of the most well-known invasive species worldwide, and poisoning a lot of the Australian biodiversity. So yeah, it can go wrong in most cases. But not to say that biocontrol is not a option. It is an option, but it has to be really well tested. And people spend years studying this host specificity and the different combinations of different scenarios as to what can go wrong. So yeah, but when it happens, it can be really successful.
Okay, so for now, Lantana and Parthenium didn't get that biocontrol.
Lantana and Parthenium do have biocontrols, but I'm not sure if they have been tried in India. So yeah, it clearly, if it had been tried and was successful, we wouldn't see any. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they have been tried in India per se.
Okay, yeah, sure. So moving on, I think Jaya's question has been answered. So Srinidhi again asked, the giant African snail is spreading quite rapidly in her community. Are there any steps that can be taken in this regard?
Yeah, that is again, giant African snail is one of the worst invasive species worldwide, and it is tough to control. Depends on how well it has invaded into your area. But yeah, there are very few ways to control it. Like, you can manually control it, but you have to be careful because it can cause some diseases in humans as well. I don't know of an example of successful management of giant African snail. They tried in Andamans by introducing another snail, but it didn't work out. And so I'm not sure if it is actually feasible. But yeah, if it is, let's say the number is in hundreds, sure. But if it is more than that, it might be tough. Community-based control could help, because giant African snail damage a lot of vegetation, especially say vegetable plantations in rural communities. And people try to control them by killing them directly, but I don't know if it has been shown to be successful anywhere. So I would tell you, Srinidhi, that yeah, maybe get in touch. Like, you can write to me and I can try to find you some resources which could help you. If not anything, I could put you in touch with some other invasion scientists who would be better suited to answer this management question. But yeah, good question.
Okay, so now Nitin asks, any species which travels through water from higher elevation, will it be considered as invasive? I don't really understand. But
As in, if it is through the water flow, let's say a river flowing from Himalayas to here, right? Yeah, if it is naturally dispersing, it is not. So it is not through human intervention. So it won't be called invasive. But in so these natural dispersal events have happened over millions of years, right? So even amphibians themselves cross oceanic, like they have been known to cross oceans. But this happens over millions of years, and this happens generally because there is a massive cyclone, and there is a floating tree, and there is a lizard on it or a snake on it. And that, no, this happens. It happens quite frequently if you understand it over a geological scale of time. Like, yes, in millions of years, there are, even though these events are very low in frequency, but over millions of years, there can be a few events that will lead to such dispersal. But those are natural dispersal. They're not human mediated, so they won't be considered invasive. Yeah.
okay, so one.
I can take over. So Garvit asks again, when we talk about invasive species, do we only talk about macroscopic organisms, or are viruses and bacteria are also included in invasive species?
They're also included. As I said, that coronavirus is actually an example of invasion. Although viruses and bacteria are generally considered, their invasion is generally considered in the field of epidemiology. And that, although there are a lot of parallels between invasion science and epidemiology, it has only been recently explored. Like, the models of invasion science are being applied to them, and their models are being applied to invasion science. But till now, there have been quite like almost parallel fields because of its public health implications. It has like invasions of bacteria and viruses are considered separately. But yeah, they're definitely, theoretically, they're invasive. Yeah. They could be invasive if that bacteria is spread through human agents. Yeah.
Okay, so one more like quote or question from Devesh. As far as he knows, such invasions cause damage the most in island systems, like you mentioned in Madagascar, Andaman, Papua New Guinea, etc. But what is the current status of invasion in the ocean, or to be specific, in the structure of coral reefs?
Right. Right. There are, so I haven't studied any invasive species in oceans per se, but when in coral reefs, the most common example is of that of the lionfish. And yeah, I can't tell you the current status of the top of my head, but yeah, it is indeed, some researchers are working on them. And marine invasions are a big problem. If we know of ballast water carried in ship being a major source of these invasive species, which is what happens when a ship is going to, let's say, load up on cargo, right? But it needs, before it loads up on cargo, it takes this bunch of water or oceanic ballast water to carry it inside the ship to balance it out when it's completely empty. And it goes to the new site, releases this water, and picks up the cargo. So in this water, there are lots of like like species which are introduced across the globe, right? So this ship is carrying a mussel which occurs, let's say, in Argentina, and it goes all the way to, let's say, Asia. So this happens. So yeah, marine invasions are a big problem, and they actually have a lot of economic cost associated with them as well. So yeah.
Okay, I think that
I have one question. Like, you collected data from the local natives of Andaman Islands and all. So how did actually you collaborated on ground? Like how did you communicate with the people? Were there any difficulties faced by you in collaborating and collecting data, communicating like that?
Right. These communities, they are in essence settlers. Um, they're not prehistoric natives. That is the tribal communities which are there. So these are settlers, but they have settled since a long time. So then the most commonly used language there is Hindi, and Bengali, which I understand and can speak a little bit of. So language-wise, there was not a major problem. And in places where these were not the languages used, I had my field assistants could speak those languages, which are Ranchi and Karen and sometimes Tamil. Um, so that is one, but I had local field assistants who helped me in some cases where I could not do the interviews myself. They would do the interviews. And yeah, uh, and I had spent quite a bit of a few years in Andamans working on other stuff before doing this project. So I was familiar with the sites, but yeah, this whole project was a massive challenge because to travel to all these villages one after the other and doing all these interviews, which I had no full training in. I'm trained as an ecologist, right? And you're only told to go do this transits or do this or do that, do point counts. But socioecology is becoming more and more important in most ecological scenarios. Like if you want to do conservation, like if you want to look at human wildlife conflict or invasion, you need to understand these things. So yeah, I think I wouldn't have been able to do this without my local collaborators. But yeah, it happened and I'm happy about it.
So you didn't interact with the Nicobar people, I mean, the indigenous ones there.
Okay, so Nicobaris are different in the sense they are settlers as well, but they are on Nicobar Islands mostly. Some of them are on Little Andaman, but not in many villages.
I've heard they eat up humans. I mean, anyone
Sorry?
they find. I've heard that, these Nicobaris people, if you're not one of them, and if you go and interact, they would, I don't know, kill you, eat you.
Oh, no,
All
not
sort
at
of
all. No, not
cannibals.
at all. That is a common misconception, and it's a bit xenophobic, right? We don't know them. That's why we fear them. No, I have been to Nicobar and I've lived with Nicobaris, and they're absolutely great people. They had, so what you're thinking of is other communities, but even for them, this is a misconception. So you're thinking of Sentinelese, which live on North Sentinel Island, which are, yeah, they're the most secluded of all the native tribal communities. And they're on a tiny island. And the government of India's approach for them is to let them be on that island. So they don't come out, and none of these so-called civilized humans intervene. And in other cases like Jarawas or Ongis, they do come into contact with other settlers from time to time, but they are in their reserve lands. So yeah, none of them, like some of them, there are some hostilities in some cases, but there is no cannibalism, and it's not an issue. So they are in way more uh, threat from us than we are from them, because they have lived in isolation for so many thousand years that they probably don't have immunity to a lot of the diseases that we carry. Even something like the common cold could be fatal for them. So yeah.
So yeah, I
So
think a protective measure against us that
absolutely,
don't go and disturb them.
exactly. And we
So
should
okay,
obviously respect their way of life.
yeah. Just the last question from my side. I mean, so with globalization and as we see trades increasing, and this invasiveness is also somehow increasing, and the native flora fauna, it's also being exposed to a lot of alien species. So, in terms of co-evolution, have you seen a rapid pace up in this, fight mechanism also from the native biota in terms of exposure from this alien species?
Yeah, there are some well-documented cases that it does happen, that over a few generations, let's say in terms of the cane, in the example of cane toad. So cane toads have these parotid glands, which are toxic to anything that eats them. And so initially in Australia, there were a lot of declines in say in monitor lizards or any other species that tries to eat them, but over time there is aversion to that toxicity, and so after a time they start avoiding it. But not to say that this happens all the time or for all the species and that everybody is safe after some time. It is not. It's not the case. But it does happen that there can be rapid evolution of aversion to deal with invasive species. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think with that, we come to an end of this evening. Audience, if you have some questions, you can just, unmute yourself and ask away, or else we can, wrap it up. I'll just give you one. Okay, yeah. So can you share your email ID to the audience? They're asking.
Yeah, sure. I'll put it in the chat box. Yeah.
And also to the audience, after this, we'll be, sending you a follow-up mail with the recorded session. You can also refer back to, and with the websites that Nitya has mentioned, from the, Indian Biodiversity Portal to iNaturalist. I think you all know that. And with that, thanks a lot, Nitya, for this evening, and we enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for, all the audience that you guys came, in a busy week to this evening and joined us. I hope you guys learned a lot about invasiveness and how you on a community level can also tackle this problem. Read up, learn what is invasive in your community, and you can add into the information that we will be needing in future, because yeah, invasiveness is not stopping. So we need to gear up. And with that, very good evening again, a good night, and yeah, if you guys want to just join us for our last session, which will be on the roadkills that you guys can monitor when you go around for some tours or anything, and that's on roadkills. I'll be sending you mails again. And thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us. Have a very good day.
Thanks, everyone. It was really wonderful. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.